Hi, this is Matt Hawkins from Top Cow, and you are entering the fan base.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fanbase Weekly podcast. This is a special edition of the podcast. We are doing a Fanbase Feature panel discussion on the recently released Alex Garland film, Annihilation. As we always do, we have a wonderful group of panelists joining us today. We have author Janet Joyce Holden, who is the author of the Origins of Blood vampire series. Hello, Janet.
Hello there. Good to be here.
Good to have you here. Thank you for joining us. We also have Claire Thorne, who is a co-host of the Fanbase Weekly podcast and a contributor to Fanbase Press. Hello, Claire.
Hello.
And, of course, we are joined by Bryant Dillon, president of Fanbase Press. Hello, Bryant.
How's it going?
And my name is Barbra Dillon. I am the editor-in-chief of Fanbase Press. We will be diving in, and before we do, we want to give a big spoiler warning to our listeners. If you have not yet read the book, Annihilation, if you have not yet seen the film, Annihilation, there are some differences, but either way, we want to warn you that there will be lots and lots of spoilers discussed herein. So if you are at all worried, please be sure to tune out, read the book, go and see the movie. Do both, honestly, because we highly encourage both forms of media. But spoilers will be had. Without further ado, Bryant, would you mind telling us a little bit about Annihilation, the film?
Lena, a cellular biologist, university professor, and former soldier in the U.S. Army, is shocked when her husband Kane returns after he has been missing for over a year. Kane becomes ill, and this leads Lena coming into contact with a government organization that takes both of them into custody and explains the situation. Kane is the only survivor of an expedition into the Shimmer, a mysterious quarantine zone within a national park. 3 years earlier, an object struck a lighthouse within the park, and the Shimmer began manifesting shortly after. Many teams have entered. Kane is the only one who's ever returned, and now outside the Shimmer, he appears to be dying. Hoping to find a cure for Kane, Lena joins a group of military scientists who are preparing to enter the Shimmer. The group is made up of all women, including a psychologist, a physicist, an anthropologist, and a paramedic. The group discovers that inside the Shimmer is full of mutating landscapes and creatures, many which are deadly. They hypothesize that the Shimmer is acting as a prism, distorting and refracting the DNA of the organisms living within. The team realizes that the Shimmer is slowly affecting them as well. As they follow clues regarding what happened to Kane's team, various events and threats pick the members of the team off one by one. Alone, Lena eventually reaches the lighthouse that is the source of the Shimmer, and it is revealed that the force that created the Shimmer is extraterrestrial, and that it will spread across the globe, creating annihilation. Lena learns that her husband actually took his own life inside the lighthouse, but not before directing a doppelganger of himself to find her. Lena encounters her own doppelganger and uses a white phosphorus grenade to set it on fire. The entire lighthouse goes up and the Shimmer disappears. Lena returns to the compound and tells her story of what happened inside the Shimmer. Later, in an ambiguous ending, Lena is reunited with Kane's doppelganger, who has now recovered.
Thank you, Bryant. So, this is going to be an interesting deep dive discussion because for our listeners who were not in attendance, for about a half an hour before we started this discussion, we had our own discussion, which
yes,
we had to put on pause to actually come and record this podcast.
I think with this movie, you have to establish really firm ground before you start a conversation about it. Otherwise, you're just going to wander off into very strange areas.
Exactly. So just to start us off, what was everyone's general reaction to the film? And just out of curiosity, when you left the film, what was your initial reaction? Janet, we'll start with you.
I enjoyed it. I read the book when it first came out a few years ago, and I haven't read it since, so I was a little muddy on the storyline, but there were certain key issues that I thought the film took and ran with very successfully, and I enjoyed it, and I came out thinking, this is they've done a good job with this, and I was entertained. So it was cool.
Claire, what about you?
This is the kind of movie you walk out of and you're not really, like I said, you're not really quite sure where you want to land in your head. There's so much to think about in it. But my very first reactions, even in the middle of the movie, was that barring anything else in the plot or characters or anything else, the visuals in this movie were so impactful and stunning and creepy and disturbing, and it's really very much in my wheelhouse of, a lot of the reasons why I love the Alien, movies, for instance, and that's just, one example of a lot of different movies that I just really hone in on, that just very dark, disturbing, yet amazingly beautiful visuals. The things that I love the most in the movie are very hard to describe to people because they're really, really gross. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, just, I want to see artwork of it. Like I'd like to have a big poster on my wall of it, but you wouldn't want to come to my home and visit me. But yeah, and since then, thinking about the story and the characters, I'm really kind of overwhelmingly satisfied with and challenged by everything that I saw in the movie. I really liked it.
Bryant?
I would agree for the most part. It took me a long time to think about this film. I would say 3 or 4 days. But it was constantly something that I was thinking about. Much like the other film that hit me that way this year was Blade Runner. I guess it's last year, Blade Runner 2049, where I wasn't sure exactly how I felt about it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it for 3 or 4 days afterwards. Both those films really make me feel hopeful about sci-fi going forward. I feel like there's some new ideas being explored. This film pulled me in right off the bat, and I was engrossed the entire time. I think the ending, which I still don't know entirely how I feel about, is, some of the twists is really where it left me going like, oh, I wonder, what is the message here? How do I feel about this? Was this something well thought through, or was this something that was, supposed to shock you, or, But in general, I would say this is a film that everyone, if they have a chance to see in theaters, they should go see it. If you can't see it in theaters, see it when it's released on Blu-ray, because you'll get something out of it, even if it's just certain scenes. There are several scenes here that I will remember, going forward as we, continue to watch movies for the rest of my life. There's stuff there that's just as scary as I've experienced in any film. There's stuff that's just as sort of engrossing or amazing as any film that I've seen. Is it going to be everyone's favorite film? No, I don't think so, but it is very much trying to say something, trying to do something new.
For me, I think that Claire and Bryant, I'm going to borrow words that you described, because I had a very conflicting response initially to this movie. I was both engrossed by throughout the film and challenged by the film, in that I came out feeling very uncomfortable. Not in a way that I could articulate why or what was happening, but just that I was left really not understanding what the message of the film was, what particular things I was to take away from the characters or the themes of the movie. And I really had to sit on it and discuss it and read about interviews with Alex Garland, information about self-destruction, given that it was a major theme of the film, and we'll talk about that shortly. But I'm now left running into a rabbit hole of research on the film and what it was trying to say. And it's fascinating, and I think that is the intention, or at least the benefit of sci-fi. And I think, like Bryant, you said about films like Blade Runner 2049, although they're not succeeding financially at the box office, they do such amazing things in media that allow us to explore the depths of humanity, the depths of our existence, and so much beyond. So I'm so excited to be talking about it further with all of you.
Well, and just to tack on to the end of that idea of not really knowing necessarily, or being handed to you in the story in the film, I think the book was very much that way as well. Janet probably will agree to me that you don't finish the book and close it and go, oh, I understand everything that they were trying to hand to me in the story. You really do feel like you have to go sit with it and research it and
I would agree. Very
unravel a lot of stuff.
So some stuff's left open ended, and you really have to draw your own conclusions, or walk further along the path and see what makes sense to you.
And what I would agree with on that aspect too, and what Claire was comparing them to the Alien franchise, I specifically like the first Alien. I feel like this film has something very similar that made that film endure for so long, and that's this idea of like striking a balance where they give you almost just enough to be able to follow the story, interpret the characters, but also keep it weird and mysterious and unexplained enough that it feels truly alien to you. You do have this feeling of like, I don't know if I don't understand this because I'm human. Like, because I come from this place and this is not from this place. You know, and I think that is really fascinating, much in the way when the first Alien came out and people debated, like, where did this spaceship come from? What is this big skeleton that had its, you know, chest blown out? What does that mean? You know, and the fact that the movie gave you only enough to kind of understand the story, but didn't explain what are the origins, that kind of thing.
Well, and I think it's an important thing to note going forward in the podcast, even that the origins of this area, the cause of what's going on in the book, is very much tied to just natural evolution, you know, the nature as we know it here. And in the movie, they go to a place of alien first contact, essentially. This is an extraterrestrial event that has happened. And I think it's interesting in a way because I don't think they overplay it so much. Like, you don't really understand that first contact necessarily, but it's an interesting parallel in what I think are the same themes, where the book is talking about the foreign nature and the inscrutable nature of nature itself compared to us. Like, we don't really understand what that world is all about, even though it's here, it's part of our universe here. And then they parallel that in the movie with it being a first contact situation where there's not any successful communication going on between the two, you know, worlds. So there's still that complete separate, you know, one side not understanding the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the film they illustrate right from the get-go that it's an extraterrestrial thing because you see something flying through the air, and bing, landing on the lighthouse.
Not something in the books.
Yeah. So you're given that, and you can take that as a stepping stone to go from then on. So.
Well, let's talk further about the film. In an interview with the director, Alex Garland, with The Verge, one of the main themes that Garland noted about the film is self-destruction, which is something that we've talked about thus far in the podcast. And to quote Garland, it's about the nature of self-destruction in a literal sense. Cells have life cycles, and stars have life cycles, and plants, and the universe, and us. You, me, everyone. But also psychological forms of self-destruction. That's the end of that quote. So this is something that we dived into pre-podcast, but I'm curious what you think that the film has to say about self-destruction and how the theme is represented in the film. Feel free, anyone, to jump in.
Well, I've fairly straightforward interpretation of this. I don't know that it covers everything, but I think to start the conversation off, I think there is a parallel of the explanation of, like, I think it's a conversation between Natalie Portman and Oscar Isaacs about, like, how a cell is built to die off or age is actually the self-destruction of the cell, and that there could be a cell that is immortal, and essentially why doesn't that exist? But I think there's this idea of, like, self-destruction is built into the building blocks of life, cells. At a cellular level, we self-destruct when we age and die, and that there is a connection thematically in this story with the idea that perhaps self-destruction that we see in humans throughout life, whether it's, examples in this story would be like, having an affair that will damage your relationship with your loved one, or committing to another example I think Alex Garland brought up in his interview was things like smoking, stuff like that, that you do, because eating fast food would be an example, but
all the good stuff.
Yeah, things that we enjoy, but we know that they come with an effect, and we do them anyways. I think there's something being said about, like, maybe it's worth considering. Is that innate? Is that built within to us? Is that part of life as much as the aging and the death?
You know, I really did like getting to explore the idea of self-destruction. Put up in, you know, they also say in the movie that the shimmer, literally the explanation of the shimmer is that it's a prism that reflects DNA, and it's clearly kind of, I almost got the feeling like it's a big alien 3D printer, right? Where they're looking at what's here and trying to understand what's here by replicating it. And when humans interact with that, there's this idea, I think, that prism is looking into and obviously altering, but it is projecting what each individual character's DNA is all about. And when you take that and you analyze the psychology going on and this idea of self-destruction and how it is explained by the fact that our cells are constantly dying and recreating themselves, that we are and that part of like evolutional, that's not a real word, but anyway, that creating something new, progressing and moving forward is self-destruction all the time. And it becomes an interesting analogy for, you know, obviously one of the big storylines, as you mentioned, Brian, is the marriage, you know, the marital relationship between Natalie Portman's character and Oscar Isaac, and how clearly that self-destruction may be seen as something purposefully damaging, but also can just be seen as something that is part of the life cycle of a marriage as well. That their marriage today, or in the present day in the story, is not the same marriage that it started out as, because it's constantly dying and being renewed. I think you can look at all of the characters and the stories in the movie through that prism.
Yeah, I had a slightly different take, and I was kind of led by the nose right at the very beginning when, you know, we saw this entity flying down and hitting the lighthouse, and so you thought, extraterrestrial. And I looked at it from the point of view, from that creature or whatever it is, that entity's point of view, in that here it's landed on this planet, and it's like, if anybody, I don't know if anybody's been to a friend's when they were kids after Christmas, and that friend's had a big box of Lego given, and you all tip it out onto the floor, and it's like, oh my god, we've got to, you know, and you start creating things with it. Right. There's all this new stuff, houses and cars and other things with wheels and stuff like that. And I thought, you know, this is what it is for this creature. It's only, instead of Lego, it's DNA. And it's got all this stuff to play with, and so it's building this big white alligator and that weird boar thing, and all these beautiful flowers and everything, and then all of a sudden, human being walks beyond the shimmer and into Area X, and oh my god, it's like Uncle Bob turning up with a Lego box with, you know, here's the stuff to build the Millennium Falcon, and you're like, oh yeah, you know, you've got to have a crack at that too. And so that's where, you know, this to me was the environment that the humans were walking into, and you know, it's quite terrifying, really, that there's something out there that could start taking us apart so readily.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I agree with you, Janet, on some of those things. Is there's clearly a feeling of like Natalie Portman realizes at one point like that they're already being affected the moment they come in the shimmer. So they're almost being like sort of disintegrated to, in a way, broken down in a way, each in different ways. And I mean, we see that almost literally, I would think, with the Ventress character, where we literally at one point see her almost break down into like these tiny pieces and reform. But the mysterious thing is, and I think there are some hints, but there is this really the terrifying thing, and the mysterious thing is like, is this just a product of the shimmer that naturally affects them in different ways? Is there an intent or purpose on the way that it's being done? You know, is there a plan, or is it just the effect?
Right,
you
and
know?
again, we don't know because we don't. There's no level of communication that can be established between whatever that entity is. If it's even an actual physical entity that's there, it could just be
something like they refer almost to radiation at one point. This could be like something like having a radioactive substance somewhere, and the closer you get, the more it affects you. But we don't know because there does seem to be intent to some degree.
Yeah, an intent to mimic, or we'd like to think so. I think because one of the what makes us human is we like to make sense of things.
Sure. Yeah.
So with something like this, there might not be any sense to it, but we'll still try and figure out a way of this is happening because, I think we struggle when we can't find answers to things like that.
I went back to the movie The Arrival, in which is
Arrival
all about
or The Arrival.
Isn't it?
Arrival.
I don't know which one it is. It's
has
Charlie Sheen.
No, Arrival with Denis Villeneuve, with Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner, in which they're trying to establish the building blocks of communication with first contact. And it, in the movie, I was thinking, this is like that potentially, where the method of communication by this entity is literally DNA.
Yeah,
and
maybe.
It may be not any more, purposeful than that, other than just he's playing with an abacus of DNA, trying to communicate,
trying to figure it out, or trying to express something.
Yeah, could be.
I want to throw out one other thing about self-destructive behavior, and it's sort of different than I think what other people might have on this, but there is, I don't know if this is intentional, but the character is named Cain that comes back and is the first one. There is a character in Alien named Cain. They both have, when you read the book or look at the movie, sort of a sense to go forward into something that feels dangerous or potentially harmful to them. Cain feels this need to, in Alien, to keep continuing and pushing the machine forward. And I think we see that also in Ventress and Lena as well, where they want to see the unexplored. There's this human need to know what is happening. Is there something, I don't know. I guess all I would say, I don't know if anyone else has anything to say on it, but there's something interesting to this idea of humans do have essentially the thing that has created the saying, curiosity killed the cat. We have a need to explore, to find out, to explain things. I think there's many things in history where we can look at scientists or explorers who did things that they knew might result in their death or injury. And there's some of that present in this movie as well. Were you going to say something, Barbra? Yes, of course. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I stepped on your toes.
Before you dive in, I will just say that Alex Garland, throughout all of his career, from Sunshine, Ex Machina on, when he's asked what his most important sci-fi influences are, Alien and the Alien trilogy is at the top of his list. So I would be shocked if Cain, the name of that character, and some of the character aspects.
And there are no names in the book, right?
There are no names in the book. Those are all Alex Garland. I would not be surprised at all if that's not a direct...
Like a nod.
A direct nod
to
and
Alien.
influence.
It could be. Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead, Barbra.
So, Bryant, to continue on your train of thought, the contribution that you just made about the more basic... drive of humans towards self-destructive patterns. In piecing together what little I have from sites like the American Psychology Association and other similar psychoanalysis sites, I'm really drawn to the idea that while this is a sci-fi film and while there's an alien element to it, different from the book, since you're, Janet and Claire, you're both saying that was not necessarily present in the book. I'm really feeling that while there is an alien element present in the film, it's utilized simply as a vehicle or a refraction, just like in the film. It's a mimicking or reflection of what we as humans do, both on an intrinsic level, on a molecular level, as well as a psychological level. So What I'm thinking is that obviously we've been talking a lot about self-destruction and how that is a recurring theme in the book. All of these, and just to read a little bit to give definitions of these things, self-destructive behavior is any behavior that is harmful or potentially harmful towards the person who engages in the behavior. It may be used as a coping mechanism when one is overwhelmed, or it can also manifest itself in an active attempt to drive away other people, which is something that we saw manifested in a lot of these characters. Another important aspect of self-destructive behavior is the inability to handle the stress stemming from an individual's lack of self-confidence. Self-destructive people usually lack healthier coping mechanisms to deal with this anxiety or stress. So I think that for me, both on a psychological level with the actions of the characters, and also on the molecular level, given that what we're talking about in this film is the breakdown and the death and destruction of cells to create new things. I think that the alien is reflecting that same self-destruction in breaking down cells and creating new things. But I think that it dives deeper, less into the granular level of why did the alien do this. I think it's less about that and more about reflecting our human anxiety with self-destruction, with our own self-destruction psychologically and molecularly. And I found, just in very brief research, there is a term called annihilation anxiety, which is defined as a mental content reflecting concerns over survival, preservation of the self, and the capacity to function. And the danger associated with annihilation anxieties is a threat to one's survival. So I found this interesting thing about the major implications that essentially, and I won't read all of it, but that this anxiety is triggered by a survival threat and found to be the basic danger that humans embrace on a psychic trauma and a very deep, primitive level.
And I think the movie allows you see every character react to this threat in the movie and respond to it differently. And the way they respond to it is reflected in what happens to them, they're changed. Every character is changed. And how they change and what happens to them is directly a result of, I think, what they bring to, their particular inner motivations around that anxiety.
Yeah. So this is by no means giving a cohesive statement on what Alex Garland was driving to do or what he was hoping to say, but I do think that this was less of a film speaking to alien motivations and more of a psychological and molecular study in human self-destruction and the creation of new things.
I totally agree with that, and I would also add that, given in his interviews, he talks about how the film gives less answers than questions, and I think we can assume, maybe as we continue this discussion, that part of the way that this film is supposed to work is, and it's not original, we've seen this before, but to pose questions and allow the audience to connect the dots. It does have things to say. It's not completely, I feel like sometimes we're frustrated by films that only pose questions and just kind of leave that work on the audience. This is not a film like that. This film has things to say, but it leaves many things mysterious so that the intention is for what is happening. Like that audiences will walk away, talk about this film, research things, like think about things, and come away with, I think, an experience beyond just entertainment for a few 2 hours.
I'm going to throw another kink into your deep dive into psychology about this. I'm reading an article, where he was listing Alex Garland's influences from Alien. He also lists 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Sure, this feels a lot like 2001.
Yeah.
It does to me too.
The comics anthology 2000 AD is a big influence on him. And then the last one that they list, and he lists this in the quote from Alex Garland, he talks about this as probably the biggest influence on Annihilation, is the works of J.G. Ballard. Which, if you're not familiar with J.G. Ballard, he's and the one I'm most familiar with is the movie Historic Crash, which is about sexualized car crash
Right, yeah.
fetishism.
People that like to get in car crashes and then
Yeah.
make love in the destruction.
Yeah, we talk about self-destruction. That is a movie, but like physically about the physical destruction of mechanical items and the
sounds
human
ridiculous,
body.
but it's exploring this idea that there are things within humans that you can't explain, but you have the urge to. You're
Right.
compelled to do.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that you probably have got a lot of very fertile ground there.
Yes.
If you want to dip
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
J.G. Ballard as
Okay.
well,
Yeah.
and kind of explore and look at some of
Sure.
the psychological themes there, I think it'll probably parallel a lot of the things going on in Annihilation.
Yeah, and I totally want to echo and concur with your sentiments that I think that, and Janet, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I think that there are manifestations of how the psychological self-destruction is manifesting in creating new things, because from psychological self-destruction there aren't necessarily
New life isn't
positive
born.
manifestations
Yeah,
or creations of new things. However, I do think that given the vehicle of the shimmer in its ability to create new things, does provide that opportunity to these characters. Like especially with Tessa Thompson's character, who's the physicist. I think that it was fascinating that so she is someone who engages in non-suicidal self-harm. She cuts herself.
She has
in order to
scars.
release pain, which non-suicidal self-harm is not always necessarily. It's definitively not necessarily an intention to kill oneself, to take one's life. But it can provide a positive release of emotion or alert others that help is needed. And I think that it's fascinating that Tessa Thompson's character, when she's towards the end of the film, there is new life growing from the cuts on her arms, and I thought that was such an interesting literal manifestation.
I did. I thought, that's yes, that it's there in particular, as opposed to anywhere else.
Almost like that, the release. Not only did it provide her release in life, but now in its new creation, it is providing her new growth and her acceptance of it.
Yes, her acceptance of it. It was almost as I want this.
Yeah, well, and she was the first character who I thought had come to a place of understanding of what was happening to her. She's the one who explains the self-destruction versus suicide, and she explains the prism. And I think it's in those actions, because it wasn't just that you look down and see that that's happening, but the progression of it happening accelerates just during the conversation that she's having. And I almost got this sense of, as she's understanding and accepting it, it's allowing whatever this mechanism is to take place as well.
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing I wanted to add was something that Bryant touched on regarding not having all the answers and everything. But I think from a storytelling point of view, having all the answers doesn't matter. It's the subject that matters, and it's a subject that's very dear to all our hearts. We're afraid of annihilation, and our life's finite, and it's a subject that we like to dip into and try and understand and everything. And I think providing you've got that in the story somewhere, that will pull people in more than something that just gives you a nice linear story with a nice happy ending. So I think that's why it makes for very compelling storytelling.
Well, and I think that's one of the reasons why the movie, I think, is could be universally successful. And I think that, there's we'll probably talk about more about how intellectual, how thought involving this movie is. And I think that studios can get really skittish about trying to market that kind of movie, but in a lot of ways I think my reaction to this was that it should be kind of universally appealing to people, both because there is that creepy horror element. It is kind of several movies in one, right? It's the sci-fi intellectual 2001: A Space Odyssey, kind of movie, but it's also Alien and Aliens. You have moments of visceral horror and very, the plot of that moves forward very well. It doesn't feel slow in any place really to me. But also, I think, and it's another change from the book, where in the book we don't really get to know, we don't know the characters' names. They are very scientific. The book is very scientific in its description of the characters and less engaging in terms of like personality with the characters. In this movie, just the characters are so nicely realized and so well portrayed, and that's probably another thing that we can talk about a little bit is, we've mentioned how much we love Jennifer Jason Leigh as the psychologist in this. Dr.
She was great.
She was amazing, but really all of the actors from
all the acting was really strong.
Gina Rodriguez, Tessa Thompson, who plays very much against type, at least for roles we've seen Tessa Thompson in recently. But I think that all of that, how really interesting these characters are really is a key to how engaging the story is.
Definitely.
Well, before we dive into those things, we are going to take a brief break. After this message, we will return with the rest of our panel discussion on the film Annihilation.
Hey listeners, this is Drew Siragusa from Fanbase Press. I'm here to let you know that in addition to our podcasts and website, Fanbase Press is also a publisher of comic books, graphic novels, and other fine media. I also wanted to let you know about one of our exciting graphic novels that will thrill and chill horror fans everywhere. Identity Thief is an unnerving, skin-crawling tale featuring a terrifying and original creature that ComicsForge.com states is just downright wickedly well done. When Daphne and Craig move into a new apartment, they have every reason to believe that they have left their troubled past behind. Everything seems perfect, but after the discovery of a mysterious hatch in his closet, Craig begins to realize that something disturbingly inhuman is seeking a way into his home, desperate to enter his life in the most intimate and unsettling way possible. BuyIndieComics.com says, Identity Thief is sexy, frightening, claustrophobic, and oh so creepy. ComicBook.com called Identity Thief a chilling modern-day horror story, perfect for fans of The Twilight Zone, Tales from the Crypt, or even obscure 80s horror anthologies like Tales from the Dark Side. Help support the giveaways, podcasts, and other free content we provide every day here at Fanbase Press by purchasing a copy of Identity Thief, or one of our other awesome graphic novels at the Fanbase online store today. Visit fanbasepress.com today and click on the store link to secure the ultimate in indie graphic novel horror.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of our Fanbase Feature panel discussion on the film Annihilation by Alex Garland. Before we signed off for our break, we were talking about the performances in the film, we were talking about the intellectual level of the film, so let's dive back into the conversation. Annihilation had struggles behind the scenes regarding studio concerns that the film was, quote, too intellectual and too complicated. The studio demanded changes, including making Portman's character more sympathetic and changing the ending, but producer Scott Rudin and director Alex Garland refused to take the notes. Do you think that the filmmakers should have taken the studio's notes, and why do you think that smart sci-fi is hard to sell in Hollywood? Janet, we'll start with you.
I don't know. I think, just going back to something I said earlier about the subject being important and not necessarily, you don't need an answer. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we go to the cinema, we've had a rough day, we want a nice light thing, and we do want, we want the happy ending kind of thing. We want, we want everyone riding off into the sunset and living happily ever after, and it's things like this. You're not going there with a subject like this. But I think maybe some people are afraid as well to touch on it. This is a very serious subject. It's not a very pleasant subject, and maybe a lot of people can't. They don't want to go there for whatever reason. They've had enough, they have enough issues going on, and they don't really want to dive into, wow, we're all going to die, and so maybe there's some resistance on that level. But I think people should, people should sort of stretch out and dive in and try, because I think you end up, even when we're talking amongst ourselves, and we have been doing this morning. You get a greater understanding of your life, and
And sorry to interrupt you, Janet, but
No,
it
no,
actually
that's fine.
ties back into something that you were talking about earlier offline when we were talking about the film in comparison to the book, in that in the book they refer a lot more to isolation of the characters. And I wonder if that's something that in real life audiences are doing by isolating themselves, and there's an avoidance, as it were, of difficult subject matter like this. And I wonder if that is something that Garland or Vandermeer wanted to portray in this story of, there is an avoidance, but there's this eventual undeniable annihilation, as it were, that will affect us all, no matter if we isolate ourselves or try to avoid it.
Yeah, although I would venture that isolation is another subject of terror for most of us, because we're social animals. We don't do well on the whole on our own. We tend to go a little crazy. And I think maybe that might be a little, not something that people want to dwell on, perhaps. So, I don't know.
I have sort of a different take on it. Not that I disagree with anything that Janet said. I just, maybe I'm a little more cynical regarding audiences. I do think that there are, well, without going too deep into it, I do think there are reasons regarding how education has, in the dumbing down of American audiences, has played into the same with our mass-produced films. I think that when you look at the way the film industry is evolving, in order to be a huge success and to require the money that is put into huge blockbusters these days, they have to be able to not only appeal to a wide audience in this country, but globally, and that means a lot of things, subtleties have to be dumbed down, or at least sort of squared or rounded off, I guess, if that's an apt metaphor, so that they can be easily transferred to multiple audiences. I do want to give, I'll give some props to, I feel like Disney has managed to do things with Star Wars and the Marvel series, and there's some of that in, X-Men, things like that, where we are seeing them try to at least put some subtext that isn't complete, just it's what I would refer to Transformers, good guys versus bad guys. At least the Marvel movies and some of these others are tapping into things like colonialism and, things that we were seeing, themes that we were seeing represented in Civil War regarding government control or oversight, but we don't see as much things like, I would say, and there's deeper, but even things that we keep bringing up, the Alien movies, when I think to things that were explored in things like Terminator and stuff like that, where we're talking about either internal character-driven stuff or human stuff that relates to the human experience in sci-fi that has somewhat been lost. Even Star Trek, which is sort of the beacon of that, when you look at the feature films these days, they are very much more action-oriented, very black and white to a degree. They're not digging as deep as they can, and maybe this is right now is where sci-fi exists. If it's not a smaller, less expensive film where a director has more control, maybe we're lucky that there are things like Netflix and some of these cable series that are coming out where they're allowing sci-fi concepts that are more layered, more complex to be explored, because less money has to be invested. There's less chance of a failure.
The fact that there are actually movie properties out there that have had success in the box office that are literally about topics about let's explore the grammar of First Contact with aliens, and this movie, among others, it's hopeful in some ways, but I think that diversifying the playing field, the box office playing field, is definitely helping with that. I'm very, very glad, and I'm kind of universally a proponent of not taking studio notes to heart when you don't have to. But it's gratifying to me, especially because I'm sitting there thinking about this note of making Natalie Portman's character more likable to the audience, which to me has a really distinctly sexist tone to it, because here's a woman who is intellectually and she's been a soldier, so she's physically and intellectually superior to most beings, around her, arguably even her own husband, and there's not much about her to dislike other than the idea that she's had an extramarital affair. And so the idea that the studio came out with this note of making her more likable is, I think, really does play into that sexist trope of women can't be seen to have betrayed the man in their lives or whatever that is. And the fact that Garland and Vandermeer and whoever else, you know, is involved in this movie saw the importance of letting her be a real character who's done good and bad things or whatever the circumstances are in her marriage, just let that be a thing, and that there wasn't this sexist idea of the woman's not
she has to be
likable
perfect
anymore
or whatever.
if she's...
Well, and to expound upon that, and I totally agree with that, Claire, and I think to expound further, it's that what do we put on her character as audience members, in that the purpose or the reason behind the extramarital affair or that act of self-destruction is not defined. I mean, who are we to know what was the cause of it? It could have been he had an affair and that launched it. It could have been a million different things.
Yeah,
But
that's
and
not
it's even-
really explained.
and it's not explained, but I think that's the purpose of almost refracting to us as the audience of what are we placing on her character? What are we assuming that because she had this affair, you know what I mean?
And there's a bunch of complexities just in that one scene that we cut back to. You know, it's a sex scene and a post-sex scene, essentially, that we cut to at different points in the film. Because I feel frustrated just as you two are, because I feel like there is an intentional complication by showing that he is married and that he sort of has some sort of I don't know if it's disdain or unfeeling for how it affects his wife. She immediately feels weird about it or uncertain about it, or maybe even disgusted by it, and kicks him out. There is a weird interaction with them at the beginning of the film where he invites her over for a barbecue. So it's not even, you can be like, she was just like, it's in no way black and white. It's this layers of gray and all manner.
What we know about their relationship draws you to, you know, you have to conclude that she's probably been on her own in this relationship for a large period of time, because this, you know, the expedition he goes on where he's missing for 12 months is not the first expedition he's been on. He's, or, you know, he is a special forces guy who is very clear that has been on other missions before.
And doesn't tell her much about him.
She doesn't get to know where he's going, how long he's going to be gone, and that has to be, you know, I can't think of a circumstance for trying to have a marriage that would be more difficult to navigate. In some ways, I felt like the person she has the affair with seemed to be her only emotional support system during this 12 months while her husband has been missing. You know, she's been grieving and not grieving during this time. Yeah, it's very ambiguous, and it should be ambiguous, but she doesn't need to be made more likable through that process to be a likable woman. You know, that's very key to me.
Yeah, and I thought, to be perfectly honest, I thought that all the characters in the film were more likable, personable than what they were in the book. Because the you know, because the way they drew the characters slightly differently. I mean, in the book they're very there's an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust between them all. So you know, it's very difficult to sort of get under. Yes, in the book. Yeah. So it's very difficult to get under the skin and empathise to a degree. Whereas I think in the film it's a little more. They had that little get together at the picnic table outside, and you know, there was that sort of interaction there, and you know, a bit more of a buddy.
Offer us any moments of casual socializing between the
you don't bond with anyone essentially.
Yeah.
No.
So can I ask? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, fine.
Can I ask with the book, and Claire, feel free to answer as well, but did you feel with the book that because you spent a longer period of time with the characters that there was some not necessarily an identifiability with the characters, but did you feel connected with the characters and their story in the book versus perhaps the reason that there was this more of a connection with the characters in the film and their social connection with one another because they had such a short span of time to connect?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there with the span of time. Because you're in the book, you're able to dive in and travel with them for a lot longer than you can in the film, and that is probably one of the big problems when you're making a film. you've got to get things down straight away, and introduce your characters, and hopefully gain empathy from the audience on the characters. So you can see there the obvious differences in how they were handled. So yeah, and in the book, I think you kind of gradually got under all their skins and got to know them a lot better as you went along. Whereas it was more of more instantaneous in the film, which it needs to be, because you don't have the time to.
It was one of the key problems I saw about turning this book into a movie was how on earth would you ever make the characters in the book become palatable or likable in any degree whatsoever to a film audience. And I think Garland did that brilliantly.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, and one thing that is really great about this cast, especially and the characters they're showing, is even if self-destruction wasn't a aspect that was being explored, these characters all feel not only, I think, charismatic enough for us to follow and well-rounded, but the self-destructive aspects and the other layers to who they are make them all complex characters. Yes, there are characters that go bad. I would say Ventress feels very cold and damaged, and I feel suspicious of her, but I don't think she's evil. Natalie Portman has her flaws, but in general, I connect with her incredibly because she does things that very much like, again, in the Alien series, Ripley does in the series, where you feel like it feels reality-based, where she's not a unbelievable hero, but she does certain heroic things. She saves individuals. She goes to look for her dead friend to make sure that she's dead. And these things bond you with her in a real way. And I mean, even characters like Josie, who eventually succumbs to the Shimmer, and I think it's Anya, who kind of loses it and ends up tying everyone up. Yeah. You understand why it's happening. It's not like, oh, there's this evil, excuse my language, but there's this evil bitch, of the group. It feels like, to me, it feels exactly the way that I felt when I watched Aliens, even as a teenager, and saw characters like Hudson, where you would see a false bravado suddenly, fall apart and under the stress of combat. It felt like this wasn't done just to, to add, some fun to the mix. It's the idea of like what would really happen with characters here. If we look at this in a realistic way, if we approach this subject matter that others might approach in a B movie way, and we approach it in a more grounded aspect, what would characters go through that were dealing with these stresses, and what would they be like if they were the individuals who would take on a mission like this? So I really appreciate that, and I also appreciate the aspect that the fact that it's an all-female party is never really... It's not like, oh, we need to put together women because, women have never tackled this problem. It's just like, oh, there happened to be a group that was all women. We don't mention it at all. It's just who was going in next,
Well, and you apologize for using the word bitch in that explanation, but I really appreciate your using that word because this is a cast of all women. It is a women-led movie, and you cannot point to any of these women and say, oh, that's the Madonna, that's the whore, that's the bitch, that's the frigid whatever. It's a group of women who all bring very vulnerable and very strong, you can pick any descriptor that you want, and it in some ways applies to all of the women at different points in time in the movie, and no matter what happens to them, how they succumb to paranoia or analyze what's going on around them, they are their own unique, very real people who are not built on tropes.
Right.
Yeah, agreed.
It was very well done.
And I think to take it one step further, that their layered portrayals and performances by the cast also reflect the going back to the self-destruction idea, that we as human beings, it's not necessarily just for women, because obviously this has affected the all-male groups in the past, but we as humans are all affected by this lack of self-confidence and how it manifests in our own different self-destructions. I mean, and they, in one scene, I believe it was with the character Shepard and Lena, when they're in the canoe and they're going through the lake, that they kind of take that moment to point out each of their own self-destructions. That for Shepard, it was the lack of self-confidence and the effect that the loss of her child, has had on her psyche. For Lena, it is her guilt for her infidelity. For I keep forgetting her name, Josie, it is the manifestation of depression through non-suicidal self-injury. So, and for Ventress, of course, we later find out that she has cancer, and so that how that is impacting her.
Well, and what is interesting that you pointed out that I think is just important to touch on with that character is cancer is literally a metaphor for what we're talking about in regards to the self-destruction and creation of something new. It is the very definition of that in life.
Yeah, we start the movie off with Natalie Portman's character in a lecture with her students explaining that, here's what we're going to be studying this year, the cancer that, and those proproperties are obviously...
Well, and very much like the alien, we don't understand cancer. We don't know why cancer exists, why it happens, what it's doing. It's an interesting to think how much it is a metaphor for the entire film.
I keep coming back to over and over again, and I would be very interested to go back and reread parts of the book and see if there are elements of it there, because I think there are. It's just different subjects, but I keep coming back to now this theme of the ability or inability to have communication between worlds, whether it's humans and the natural world that we live in, as would be, depicted in the book, or humans and a potential extraterrestrial entity with which there is just a completely, down to quantum physics almost. We don't, we always talk about, are we arguing about quantum physics, but down to that level of just a separation of basis for communication. And I think it's a really interesting analogy, again, to play out with all of the character developments in the movie and the book about lack of communication between the characters.
Yeah, between them too.
And
that was very big.
How much paranoia there is between the characters, the lack of communication potentially between Lena and Kane in their marriage, and the lack of communication, I think, that you see between even her and ability to communicate and the man that she's having an affair with, all across the board. I think it's
and one other thing, Claire, that you had touched upon, and that is not only that it is a majoritively female cast, but there has been some discussion in media, in journalism, and larger audiences of the whitewashing of the film, given that if Claire and Janet, you've read on to other books, that these characters are portrayed as other ethnicities than they are in this film. But I do have to applaud the film in that, and I don't know if this is something that everyone picked up on, but especially from the first scene of the film in the classroom, majoritively female students. And not only that, but one character is Muslim with a hijab. And this continued on. I mean, obviously in The Shimmer it was limited because we only saw so many characters, but in the hospital scenes, in the school scenes, you were seeing more in what would have otherwise been male, nondescript characters.
We're seeing more of everybody, which is good.
And I think that plays into why this question of whitewashing, I think, is a little bit knee-jerk in this area, because the timing of Alex Garland taking on and developing the script, he did that with just the first book at his disposal, and in the first book there's no ethnicity description. All of these characters are the biologist, the psychologist. You have no indication at all of what ethnicity they are. So when he developed the script for the movie, he didn't have that to work with. So technically he didn't whitewash in some ways, because he did assign ethnicities to other charters that are not white.
Right. I mean, apart from gender, that's a book you could pick up, and you could
imagine what
overlay anything you wanted, which is great.
I'm sure when the second and third book then came out, they could have switched some of the characters, but given the fact that the timing happened that way, and B, that the rest of the movie is so, whether it's the university, all of the extras in this movie are wildly, and then you come to the scenes where she's being interviewed afterwards. There's this group of people watching her through the glass, and Benedict Wong is the gentleman who is, which I have a fan theory about Benedict Wong's
No
involvement
Doctor
in this
Strange.
movie. Oh yeah, this could all just be a Doctor Strange event.
Actually, my mind went to Blade Runner 2049.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
is he in Blade Runner?
He was in that, I don't think it was actually in the film, but he was in this extra scene.
Oh, he was, yeah.
That
he
was amazing, where he was actually interrogating Jared Leto's
Yeah, I forgot about
character.
that. He
And it was a
was.
fascinating scene.
Oh, okay.
So that's where my mind
I'm
went.
sorry, if your fan theory rides on a bonus scene from the DVD, that's really out there.
You know what I just wanted to add is I agree with everything Claire's saying. I think that in this situation, not to dismiss anyone that feels, strongly about the fact that they think that there is a problem with whitewashing. I think there is a problem with whitewashing in Hollywood.
Oh, yeah.
This director specifically, when you read these interviews, it's weird. But he was like, he's like in this Verge interview, was like, yeah, I signed on for 3 films. I told them I'm only doing 1. Like, I know I had to sign on for 3, but I'm only doing this 1. I'm only interested in the first book. I developed it while the second and third book were being written. So it's kind of this weird situation where, like, he didn't even pay attention to any of the other stuff that was going on beyond the first book. And whether that's right or wrong, I mean, can be debated, but that's how it happened. It wasn't an intention to, like, go with a white actress. And then we have the actresses, Jennifer Jason Leigh and Natalie Portman admitting, like, hey, we do think this is a problem, that we are casting these roles, but, this is how it happened. We want to try to fix this problem. Mm-hmm. So I think in this one case, again, without saying to anyone who feels differently, like, you're wrong, I do think that it's worth thinking about, like, perhaps with cases like this, whitewashing, looking at whitewashing needs to be approached as similar to the Bechdel test. We don't have a straight, hard and fast black and white rule that if something doesn't pass the Bechdel test, it's immediately wrong. Mm-hmm. It's just simply something to help us correct the problems that are around. It's not a definitive litmus test. And I think that's the way that maybe whitewashing needs to be approached when looking at this film.
Yeah. We are rapidly reaching the end of our time, but given that we are all fans of movies and media and books and everything, I want to give us an opportunity to kind of fan out and be fans of sci-fi and do a deeper dive into the granular ending of the film and what may have happened. So in the finale of the film, Lena encounters the source of the shimmer, as well as a humanoid entity that mimics her every motion and eventually becomes her own doppelganger. Later, Lena reunites with Kane's doppelganger, which Bryant mentioned at the beginning of the podcast in his explanation of the film, who recovered rapidly when the shimmer was destroyed. She asks him whether he's the real Kane, to which he replies, I don't think so. They embrace, and the film ends on shots of their irises shifting in color and shimmering. How did you interpret the finale of the film? Are you intrigued or frustrated by the ambiguous ending? What were your thoughts, explanations? Go for it. What did you think, Janet?
Well, I thought 2 things. Mm-hmm. The first one was that that portion of the entity at the lighthouse destroyed itself. Maybe by becoming enamored. Oh, look, I'm on fire. Wow, isn't this great? And it starts wandering around and it's like, no, you roll on the ground and stop it.
Janet, you're blowing my mind, because would that be another interpretation or manifestation of its own self-destructive?
Yes. Yeah, no,
yes.
exactly.
Oh my gosh!
It self-destructs at the end.
Self-destructs.
But then, again, this is probably something we talked about before we started the podcast, and about having an infinite supply of energy to work with. The male character who walked out of the shimmer was struggling. He's dying. Now the one inside has burned itself up and it's not alive anymore, presumably. Then he starts getting a lot better, and she's fine. So maybe that energy that was in Area X is now within those 2. Maybe.
Yeah,
that was my take.
Okay,
I read it as, regardless of whether the people we end up with, the Lena and the Kane we end up with at the end, whether they're their doppelganger or not their doppelganger, it doesn't really matter, because regardless of whether a doppelganger appeared, a mimic of them, they were already both being affected at a cellular level as well. So they, whether their doppelgangers are not there any longer, or at least Lena's is not, it doesn't really matter one way or the other. They were both already being reworked to begin with. So that question of, are you the original Kane? Are you the original Lena? Regardless, we weren't going to end up with the same characters, and we don't understand yet the degree to which that transformation is going to happen. Is this, will they retain a sense of themselves, or will this be a truly kind of invasion of the body snatchers kind of event? Does the Shimmer then cease to exist as a geographical location, but it's now in a person, an individual, biological individual event happening? And is that, if it is a takeover by something else in Annihilation, is that continuing to move forward? Is it intentional? Is it not intentional? We don't know. Is it just a byproduct of this attempt at communication, or not? Who knows? But I did feel like they were very, in the movie, distinctly telling us these are not the same people.
I kind of agree. I will say I get a little bit lost. I think that there's more to be deciphered regarding the mirror sequence, when there is the entity that sort of just looks like a faceless person that's mirroring everything with Lena, because it goes on for so long that I feel like there's something thematic or something about that sequence, and about it like stopping her from leaving and stuff. But when we get to the end, I think, while I don't know that I have definitive answers, I would agree with Claire and Janet that I feel like the intention is we are not the same, and whether we are not the same because we are a clone or doppelganger of who we were, or whether we're not the same because our DNA or our cellular structure was changed while in the Shimmer. Because I don't think that Natalie Portman I think she's the original Lena that went in. I think she's just changed. Or even just metaphorically, if you were just someone who was not the same because you went through an experience and that leaves you not the same, the idea is no one is the same. We are always changing. We are always becoming new people. And there is, I think, like a Twilight Zone kind of like, like, what are these creatures going to do? But it could be as simple. I think they leave you with that for you to imagine, because it could be as simple as they go home and they live a different life, or it could be like they end the world. Who knows?
Do what they have? Does it spread, or does it? Do they just think, oh, okay, let's get back together
and I like that there's an idea of self-awareness about it. I mean, again, you go back to the movie Arrival. Amy Adams' character, the main character in that movie, by virtue of her learning to communicate with this other thing, she is changed. She evolves into a different, human than she was prior to those events. It's very synonymous in a lot of ways.
And maybe, Bryant, I think that profoundly answers my question at the beginning of this podcast, in that, what is the new creation? Because obviously we have the new creation that spawns from the molecular self-destruction.
Sure, yeah.
It is new life in new molecules being created. However, the creation from a psychological point of view in self-destruction is that we are changed on a emotional and mental level by the events that befall us and how we decide to move forward from them. So I think that's fascinating. Sadly, that does bring us to the end of this conversation, which has been...
We're going to talk about it more, right?
Yes, this has been one of my absolute favorite discussions that we've had for a Fanbase feature. So thank you to Janet and Claire and Bryant for joining us. This has been absolutely fascinating. I think I don't know of another occasion where I have, after having a discussion about a film, loved it more. So thank you for allowing me that experience. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our audience for listening. You can find more Fanbase features through the Fanbase Weekly podcast, which is on iTunes, as well as the Fanbase Press website. But thank you again for listening, and stay tuned for more episodes.
This has been part of the Fanbase Press podcast network.